Hey guys, tonight, we're going to drift back in time further than you might expect on the trail of something so simple, so fundamental, that it powered armies, discovered continents, and kept generations alive through the bleakest of winters. You're on the deck of a creaking wooden ship, the vast, unforgiving ocean stretching out in every direction. There are no convenience stores, no refrigerators, no delivery apps. There is only the wind, the water, and the barrel of food beside you. Honestly, given the state of 17th century maritime medicine, you probably won't survive this journey, but the food is designed to. That food is salt pork. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, I love seeing where you're all listening from, so feel free to post your city or country and the local time in the comments. It is always a little magical to think of us all drifting off together from different corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine for a moment that your world is ruled by the sun and the seasons. Your life is a constant race against decay. The fruit you pick today will be rotten in a week. The fish you catch will be spoiled by tomorrow. The animal you hunt is a fleeting bounty, a feast that must be consumed quickly before nature reclaims it. This is the world before the quiet, steady magic of preservation. In this world, winter is not just a season of cold, it is a looming threat, a hungry ghost that can empty a village. The future is a place you can't pack for. Long journeys are not just difficult, they are nearly impossible, tethered to the short leash of how much fresh food and water you can carry. To venture out, to build, to survive the lean times, you need to defeat time itself. You need a way to stop the clock on your food. And for millennia, humanity's greatest weapon in this fight was a simple, crystalline rock: salt. You hold a handful of it. It's coarse, maybe a little gray and impure, scraped from a dried-up seabed or boiled down from a briny spring. It feels like rough sand against your skin. You've tasted it your whole life, of course. It makes things taste more. But its true power is invisible. When you rub this salt into a fresh piece of meat, a silent microscopic battle begins. The salt, through the process of osmosis, is a powerful magnet for moisture. It pulls the water from the cells of the meat, and just as importantly, it pulls the water out of any bacteria or mold spores that have landed there. Without water, these tiny agents of decay cannot survive. They shrivel and die. The meat, now drier and suffused with salt, becomes an arid landscape, a desert where the germs of rot can find no purchase. It is no longer a fleeting meal. It is a promise. It is food for next month, for next season. It is security, packed away in a cool, dark place. Of course, you need the right kind of meat for this process. While people salted fish and fowl and beef, the undisputed king of the salt cure was the pig. The humble pig was a marvel of biological efficiency. Unlike cattle that required vast pasture, a pig could be raised in a small pen, even in a village or town. They are true omnivores, happy to convert kitchen scraps, fallen acorns, and just about anything else into dense, calorie-rich meat and, crucially, fat. That fat is key. When you salt pork, the fat also cures, becoming a stable, high-energy food source that won't go rancid nearly as quickly as other animal fats. A single pig, raised over a season, could provide a family with enough preserved meat and lard to last an entire winter. It was a walking, snorting larder, a four-legged savings account against starvation. This fundamental technology of salt and pork is ancient. So ancient, it's hard to pinpoint its exact origin. Historians still argue whether the earliest forms of meat curing were accidental, perhaps from meat left in salty coastal areas, or a deliberate technological innovation passed down through careful instruction. What we do know is that by the time of the great ancient civilizations, it was a well-established practice. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, were masters of salt. We know them for using natron, a type of salt, for their famous mummification rituals. It's a bit of a strange thought, but the same principle they used to preserve a pharaoh for the afterlife was used by a commoner to preserve a fish for the next week. It's all about stopping decay. You can just imagine an ancient Egyptian dad joking, "Don't touch that, kids, it's for the ancestors." The ham, I mean, not great-uncle Thutmose. Evidence of salting fish and meats appears all over the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to ancient China. where texts describe specific methods for curing meat over 2,000 years ago. But it was the Romans who truly industrialized the process, turning salt pork into a strategic resource. The vast Roman Empire was built and maintained by its legions, and legions, as the saying goes, march on their stomachs. They needed a food that was calorie-dense, portable, and incredibly slow to spoil. Salted pork was the perfect solution. It could be packed in barrels, loaded onto carts or ships, and distributed to troops on the farthest flung frontiers of the empire. In fact, a mainstream historical fact you might know is that the word salary comes from the Latin word salarium, which referred to the money paid to Roman soldiers to buy salt. That's how essential it was. It wasn't just a seasoning. It was a cornerstone of military logistics and, by extension, the entire economic and political stability of the empire. Salt was worth fighting for, worth paying for, a form of currency you could actually eat. It was this powerful combination, the humble pig and the precious salt, that created a food capable of fueling the long, quiet journeys of history. So you have this foundation, this ancient partnership between a crystal and an animal, that allows a Roman legionary to carry his food for weeks on end. But let's zoom in a little closer on these two protagonists, because their individual stories are just as important as their collaboration. You have to understand why it was this specific animal and this specific mineral that became so deeply woven into the fabric of survival. Let's start with the pig. To a modern eye, accustomed to tidy, plastic-wrapped portions in a supermarket, the pig might seem, well, a bit messy. But to your ancestors, a pig was the most sensible, practical, and efficient protein-producing machine imaginable. Imagine you are a peasant farmer with a small plot of land and a growing family. You can't afford vast fields for a herd of cattle to graze. You don't have the time or resources to chase wild game every day. What you have are the byproducts of your life. The whey left over from cheese making the vegetable peels and apple cores from the kitchen. The fallen nuts from the single oak tree at the edge of your property. The very mud in your yard. For a pig, this is not waste. It is a feast. The pig is a biological recycling unit of unparalleled genius. It diligently converts all of this low-value organic matter, things you cannot eat, into high-value fat and protein. It is a quiet, snuffling alchemist, turning garbage into gold. It requires no shepherd, no vast pasture, just a sturdy fence and your daily scraps. And the return on your minimal investment is astonishingly fast. A cow has a long gestation period and typically gives birth to a single calf. It takes a long time to grow that calf to a size suitable for slaughter. A sow, however, can produce a large litter of piglets, sometimes more than 10 at a time, twice a year. These piglets grow with remarkable speed. The animal you are feeding in the spring can be the cured meat that feeds your family through the winter. This rapid life cycle made the pig an incredibly reliable source of food. There was always another one growing, another promise of future security. It's no wonder that in many cultures the family pig was a cherished possession, a cornerstone of the household economy. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of the pig in European agriculture was driven more by its biological efficiency or its unique cultural symbolism in various pagan and later Christian traditions, where it often represented abundance and fertility. When the time came for slaughter, the pig's true genius was revealed. It was a masterclass in an ancient philosophy we now call nose to tail. Absolutely nothing was wasted. The prime cuts of meat from the back, belly, and legs were destined for the salt barrels. The tougher, smaller bits were ground up. The intestines were cleaned and used as sausage casings to hold that ground meat. The blood was used to make puddings and sausages rich in iron. The very bones were boiled down for broth. And the fat was rendered into pure white lard, a stable cooking medium and a vital source of calories that would last for months in a cool pantry. Even the tough skin could be fried into cracklings and the bristles were used to make brushes. The pig was not just a meal, it was a package of essential household goods. Now, for the other half of our duo, the salt. If the pig was a common, accessible creature, salt was often the opposite. We take it for granted, a cheap commodity in a cardboard shaker. But for most of history, obtaining salt was an arduous, expensive, and often dangerous business. Its value was immense, sometimes literally worth its weight in gold. because it was so difficult to produce in large quantities. If you lived by a warm, sunny coast, you could build shallow ponds or salt pans to trap seawater and let the sun do the slow work of evaporation, leaving the salt crystals behind. But if you lived inland, your options were far more difficult. You either had to find a rare, briny spring and spend countless hours boiling the water away, a process that consumed enormous amounts of firewood, or you had to mine it. Imagine yourself deep underground in a place like Hallstatt in Austria, one of the world's oldest salt mines. The air is cool and still, tasting of minerals. By the dim, flickering light of a pine splinter torch, you hack away at a wall of solid rock salt with a bronze pickaxe. The work is claustrophobic, back-breaking, and perilous. Cave-ins were a constant threat, yet for thousands of years, people ventured into the dark belly of the earth to excavate this precious mineral. The sheer effort and danger involved in mining salt, or the fuel required for boiling brine, made it an expensive and highly controlled substance. It wasn't a simple seasoning, it was a strategic resource, like oil or uranium today. Because it was so essential and often so scarce, salt was a perfect item for governments to control and tax. A truly famous example is the French gabelle, a tax on salt that was brutally enforced for centuries. It was hated by the common people, who needed salt not as a luxury, but for basic survival, to preserve their food for the winter. The tax was uneven, impossibly high, and enforced by armed agents. Smuggling salt became a major criminal enterprise, and getting caught could mean prison, or worse. The gabelle was one of the key grievances that simmered for generations, eventually boiling over into the French Revolution. In ancient China, during the Han Dynasty, the state went a step further, declaring a complete monopoly on both salt and iron. A special government agency managed the salt trade, and if you were caught producing or selling it privately, the punishment could be death. In a display of grim bureaucratic poetry, they would sometimes execute you by boiling you alive in the illegal brine you were caught with. It sent a very clear message. This simple, life-giving crystal belongs to the state. It was this precious, politically charged mineral, one from the sea, the earth, or the spring, that when combined with the humble, efficient pig, created the fuel for the ages to come. So you have these two essential components: a pig that is a marvel of efficiency, and salt that is a hard-won, politically charged treasure. When you combine them, you create a powerful fuel, and the first great engine to run on this fuel was the Roman Republic, and later, the Roman Empire. The iconic Roman eagle, the Aquila, that was carried into battle at the head of every legion, might as well have had a slab of bacon in its talons. Because while we think of Roman power in terms of sharp swords, disciplined formations, and brilliant engineering, none of it would have been possible without their mastery of a much more mundane art: logistics. And at the heart of that logistical triumph was salt pork. You are a quartermaster, an optio, attached to the Legio X Gemina, stationed on the cold, damp frontier in Germania. It's your job to manage the supplies for a cohort of nearly 500 men. Every single day, each of those men needs about 3,000 calories, maybe more, to march, dig, build, and fight. Now multiply that by the 28 legions of the Empire, add in the auxiliary troops, and you're looking at feeding 500,000 men scattered across 3 continents. It is a task of terrifying scale, a spreadsheet of hunger that spans the known world. You can't rely on foraging alone, it's too unpredictable and would strip the local countryside bare in weeks. You need a steady, reliable, and durable source of calories. You need barrels upon barrels of salted pork. The genius of salt pork for a military planner like you is its sheer resilience. A bushel of wheat can get wet and sprout or mold. A shipment of fresh vegetables will wilt and rot. But a slab of salt pork nestled in its brine or packed in dry salt is patient. It can be jolted in a wagon down one of your famous Roman roads for hundreds of miles. It can sit in the humid hold of a cargo ship crossing the Mediterranean, your Mare Nostrum, our sea, for weeks. It can be stored in a damp storehouse through a long winter, and when you finally open that barrel, it will be as perfectly preserved as the day it was packed. It is dense with the fat and protein your soldiers need to fuel their bodies. It is, for your purposes, the perfect military food. And so the Empire organized its production on a truly industrial scale. Vast agricultural estates in the fertile lands of Gaul, Spain, and North Africa were dedicated to raising pigs specifically for the army. The process was systematized, from breeding to slaughter to the curing houses where men worked, their arms coated in salt, packing the meat into standardized clay amphorae or wooden barrels. Now, slip out of the quartermaster's tent and into the worn leather sandals of a common legionary. You are marching one foot in front of the other, the Gallic mud sucking at your heels. On your back is a heavy frame carrying your gear, your shield, your javelins, your cloak, your entrenching tools. And among that gear is a small, heavy piece of personal equipment, your own hand mill, a mola manuaria, for grinding the daily wheat ration you receive. Every soldier carried one. It was a chore to use, but it meant you always had fresh flour for your bread or porridge, a small comfort far from home. At the end of the long day's march, you and the 7 other men of your contubernium, your tent group, your family out here on the frontier, gather around the fire. The centurion has distributed the annona, the daily rations. You get your measure of wheat, some sour wine called Pasca, which is safer to drink than local water, and a hard, stiff slab of salt pork. It's not an elegant piece of meat. It's pale and greasy, and the salt crystals glitter on its surface. Your first job, a task repeated at campfires from Scotland to Syria, is to soak it. You slice off a piece and put it in a pot of water, letting it sit to draw out some of the ferocious saltiness. Maybe you change the water once or twice. As it cooks, sputtering in a pan over the fire, a familiar, comforting smell fills the air. The fat renders out, sizzling and popping, and you might use it to fry your flatbread, a piece of culinary synergy born of necessity. The final taste is intensely salty, chewy, and rich. It's not the food of home, not by a long shot. You dream of your mother's roasted chicken or fresh figs, but it's hot, it's savory, and it fills your belly. You eat this, or something very much like it, almost every day for your 20 years of service. It's the taste of the army. Historians still argue whether the standard legionary diet, heavy in grain and preserved meats, was nutritionally adequate for long-term health, or if it contributed to chronic issues that aren't well documented in the historical record. But what is not up for debate is the strategic advantage this diet provided. The fact that the Roman state could reliably provide these rations is a cornerstone of its military success. An army that is fed is an army that can fight. An army that can carry its food with it can march deeper into enemy territory and stay longer than any tribal opponent who relies on seasonal foraging. Your famous Roman roads were not just for marching soldiers. They were the arteries of this empire-wide stomach, carrying rivers of grain, wine, and salted pork to the frontiers. The Roman eagle flew further, the Roman sword cut deeper, and the Roman wall stood stronger, all because of the simple, salty promise packed in a barrel. The world built by the Romans, a world of paved roads and interconnected supply depots, eventually crumbled. The legions marched into memory, and the grand industrial system of provisioning fractured and faded. But the fundamental technology, the simple magic of salt and pork, did not disappear. It simply went local, back to the family farm and the village smokehouse. And on the cold, wind-swept shores of Scandinavia, it was being perfected for a new kind of journey, one that would not follow roads, but the great, wild highways of the open ocean. The age of the legionary was over. The age of the Viking had begun. You are now on a longship, its dragon-headed prow slicing through the gray, choppy waters of the North Sea. There is no deck beneath you, just rough-hewn planks. There is no shelter from the relentless wind and the stinging salt spray. You are completely exposed to the elements, huddled in wool and leather. The ship is a masterpiece of design, long, narrow, and flexible, built to be both lightning-fast and seaworthy. But it is not a comfortable place. It is a weapon, a vehicle, not a home. Space is ruthlessly optimized for men and oars. There is no galley for cooking, no cozy bunks, and certainly no vast cargo hold like a Roman merchant vessel. Every single thing you bring aboard has to earn its place. And that goes double for the food. Your provisions are crammed into small wooden chests and leather bags, tucked under the rowing benches and lashed to the mast. The food must be calorie-dense, immune to the damp, and require no cooking. because a fire on an open wooden boat in the middle of the ocean is a suicidal idea. So what do you eat? You eat salt pork, of course, cured hard as a rock. You eat stockfish, cod that has been salted and dried in the cold northern air until it is pale and stiff as a board. You eat hard, dry flatbread, little more than flour and water baked until it's indestructible. And you wash it down with water or ale from a precious cask. This is the fuel for your journey, and it is as tough and uncompromising as the sea itself. At midday, the rhythm of rowing might pause for a meal. You reach into a sack and pull out your portion. It is not a pleasant communal meal around a warm fire like a Roman legionary might have enjoyed. You gnaw on a piece of cold salt pork, its intense saltiness making you thirsty. You might have to hammer a piece of stockfish against the gunwale to break it into edible shards that you chew and chew, slowly softening the tough fibers in your mouth. It's a joyless, functional process. The food is not for pleasure. It is to give your arms the strength to pull the oar for another 6 hours. It is to keep the cold that seeps into your bones from extinguishing the fire of life within you. It is pure, unadorned survival. For a rare treat, there might be a break from the monotony. A quirky and fascinating tidbit from this era is that the Vikings sometimes brought live animals with them on their voyages. You might look over and see a goat or even a pig, one of your land-based larders tethered near the mast, surprisingly calm amidst the chaos of the sea. If you make landfall on some uninhabited island to replenish your water casks, the animal might be slaughtered and you would have the unbelievable luxury of fresh roasted meat. It was a clever way to carry fresh food, a self-propelled meal that didn't take up much extra room. It must have been a strange sight, a boat full of fearsome warriors sharing their ride with a pig who was, blissfully unaware, on a one-way trip. It was this brutally effective, if unappetizing diet that powered the Viking expansion. These preserved provisions allowed them to remain at sea for weeks, crossing vast stretches of open water that would have terrified other sailors of the age. This self-sufficiency is what made them such effective raiders. They could appear suddenly on a coastline, their men well fed and ready to fight without having to stop and forage along the way. But it also fueled their incredible journeys of exploration and settlement. This diet of salt pork and dried fish is what carried them to Iceland, then to Greenland, and ultimately, in a stunning feat of seamanship, to the shores of North America around the year 1000 AD. This mainstream historical fact, the settlement at L'Anseau Meadows in modern-day Canada, predates Columbus by nearly 5 centuries, and it was made possible by food that could endure the harsh crossing of the North Atlantic. The sheer audacity of these voyages is still staggering. Archaeologists and historians still argue about the precise methods of Viking navigation, whether they relied primarily on sun compasses, sight of land and seabirds, or possessed a more sophisticated, though unrecorded, understanding of currents and stars. Part of this debate involves their food. How much did they rely on what they packed versus what they could catch or find? Every voyage was a calculated risk, a careful equation of food, water, distance, and time. The salt pork and stockfish were their insurance, the known variable in a sea of unknowns. Where the Romans had a massive state-sponsored catering service, the Vikings had what amounted to a personal survival kit. But the core principle was the same. A long, quiet journey into the unknown required a food that had already conquered time. The longship fades over the horizon, a ghost of a forgotten journey, and while these incredible voyages to the edge of the known world were rewriting the maps, a much quieter, more universal story was unfolding across the farmlands of Europe. History often focuses on the great deeds of kings and explorers, but the vast majority of people were not sailing to new continents. They were locked in a far more intimate struggle, the yearly battle to survive the winter. For them, the long journey was not across the sea, but through the darkness and cold, from one harvest to the next. And in this journey, the humble pig and the precious salt were more important than any king-esque decree or explorer-esque discovery. You are now in a medieval peasant's hut. The year is perhaps 1250. The world of epic sea voyages is a fantastical tale you might hear from a traveling minstrel, if you're lucky. Your world is the village, the church, the fields, and the woods, all owned by the lord of the manor. Your home has a dirt floor and a single room, which you share with your family, and on the coldest nights maybe a few precious animals. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke from the central hearth, a smell that clings to your woolen tunic and never quite leaves. Your life follows a relentless, predictable rhythm. You plow and plant in the spring. You tend the crops and pray for rain in the summer. You work from sunup to sundown during the autumn harvest, gathering the grains that will form the bulk of your diet. And then, you wait. Winter is coming. Winter is the great enemy. The days shorten, a deep cold settles into the earth, and the world outside your small hut becomes barren and hostile. There is nothing to forage, nothing to hunt easily. The future of your family for the next 4 months depends entirely on what you have managed to store. Sacks of grain, bins of root vegetables, and, most importantly, the living, breathing promise that has been snuffling and rooting in a small pen behind your home all year: the family pig. This single animal is the culmination of a year's worth of careful management. It has eaten your table scraps foraged in the woods for acorns, a practice called pannage that you likely paid the Lord a tax to be allowed, and slowly converted all of it into a dense package of life-saving fat and protein. As the first hard frost stiffens the mud, the day arrives. It is the time of the boucherie, the annual slaughter. This is not a sad day, but a deeply significant one, a cornerstone of your year. The entire family is involved. The work is hard and visceral, a direct confrontation with the realities of life and death. The air is crisp and cold. You can see your breath as your father and a neighbor wrestle the pig into submission. The sounds are sharp, the work is swift, and soon the carcass is being scalded with boiling water, so the bristles can be scraped off with sharpened pieces of wood. Every part of this process is a skill passed down through generations. Nothing can be afforded to be wasted. Your mother and sisters are ready with buckets to catch the blood, which will be mixed with oats or barley and spices to make black pudding. The long, delicate work of cleaning the intestines for sausage casings begins. The men set to butchering, the rhythmic sound of the cleaver striking the wooden block echoing in the yard. The great hams are removed, the shoulders, the belly. Each piece is assessed and designated for its purpose, and the most important purpose is preservation. You help carry the heavy cuts to the saloir, the great wooden salting tub that sits in the coolest corner of your hut or a small cellar. It is your family's treasure chest. Here, the true alchemy begins. Your hands, chapped and cold, plunge into a sack of coarse gray salt. You take a handful and begin rubbing it vigorously into a large piece of pork belly. You must work it into every crevice, every fold. It's a physical, demanding process. The salt feels like sharp gravel against your skin and the cold meat. Once a piece is thoroughly coated, it's placed carefully into the bottom of the tub. Another layer of salt is sprinkled over it, and then the next piece of meat goes in. You continue this process, meat, salt, until the tub is full. A heavy wooden lid is placed on top, often weighted down with a large stone. And now, you wait again. Over the coming weeks, the salt will do its slow, silent work, drawing out the moisture, turning the perishable meat into a stable food that will see you through the leanest months. Of course, not all of this bounty is yours to keep. As a part of the feudal system, you owe a portion of your production to the lord of the manor. The best ham, the choicest cut of bacon, might be destined for his castle larder as part of your rent. It is a constant, pressing anxiety, producing enough to feed your own family while also satisfying the demands of the powerful. Historians still argue about the true extent of meat consumption in the medieval peasant diet. While the annual pig slaughter provided a significant amount, some argue daily meals were overwhelmingly grain-based, with salted pork used more as a flavoring for pottage than as a main course. A small, salty, fatty piece dropped into a bubbling pot of cabbage and barley could transform a bland meal into something deeply savory and satisfying. It was a little bit of luxury, a little bit of security, in a world that offered very little of either. The salt pork in your medieval cellar is more than just food. It's a technology of patience, a way of surviving a long, quiet journey through the season of death. For centuries, this was its primary purpose: to help people stay put, to endure. But the world is beginning to stir again. The insular, land-based life of the Middle Ages is giving way to a new era of curiosity, commerce, and ambition. Maps are being redrawn. New trade routes are being imagined. and the quiet domestic technology of the peasant larder is about to be scaled up and sent back out to sea for journeys longer and more audacious than even the Vikings could have conceived. You are standing on a bustling dockside in Seville, Spain, in the early years of the 16th century. The air is a thick soup of smells, the sharp tang of hot tar being used to caulk the ships, hulls the rich aroma of spices from the east, the damp fishy smell of the river, and the overwhelming earthy scent of livestock. The sound is a chaotic symphony of human effort, shouted commands in a dozen languages, the rhythmic thud of mallets, the creak of ropes under strain, and the constant rumble of wooden barrels being rolled across the cobblestones. Towering over it all are the ships themselves, vessels like carracks and caravels, their tall masts scraping the sky. They are being prepared for a voyage not just to a neighboring port, but into the vast, terrifying emptiness of the unknown Atlantic. These new journeys are different. The Romans marched on known roads. The Vikings, for all their daring, mostly navigated a sea dotted with islands and coastlines they understood. But men like Columbus and now Magellan are sailing off the edge of the map. They are launching themselves into a void with no certain knowledge of the destination, the duration, or the dangers they will face. How do you pack for a trip when you don't know how long it will be? The answer is, you pack for forever. You provision the ship as if it is a floating planet, a self-contained ark that must sustain its crew for not just months, but potentially years. The single most critical element for the success of these ventures, more than the bravery of the captain or the skill of the navigator, was the quality and quantity of the food and water in the hold. And so, on the shore, a massive industry has sprung up, echoing the logistical machine of the Romans but repurposed for the sea. You see herds of pigs being driven towards slaughterhouses near the docks. You see carts piled high with sacks of salt, a mountain of the precious crystal that was once so dear to the peasant. In vast open-air factories, the process you witnessed on the small farm is repeated on a staggering scale. Hundreds of carcasses are butchered, the meat carved and trimmed, then handed off to teams of men who rub, pack, and seal it into endless rows of sturdy oak barrels. It is a methodical, unglamorous, and absolutely essential assembly line, turning living animals into preserved protein, the fuel for empire. This salt pork, along with salted beef, formed the core of what you might call the holy trinity of long-haul sea provisions. The first part of this trinity was the ship's biscuit, or hardtack. It was a simple, brutal food, flour and water, perhaps a little salt, mixed into a dense dough and baked 4 times until it was as hard and durable as a piece of wood. It would last for years, though it was famously susceptible to weevil infestations. The second part was drink, casks upon casks of beer, wine, and water. The alcoholic beverages were often safer, as they were less likely to grow stagnant and foul than water stored for months in a wooden barrel. And the third part, the savory heart of the diet, was the barrel of salt meat. Together, these 3 things, biscuit, booze, and bacon, were the staples that would form a sailor's diet for the next 300 years. The planning involved was meticulous. When Ferdinand Magellan prepared his fleet of 5 ships in 1519 for what would become the first circumnavigation of the globe, his shopping list was a testament to the logistical challenge. He loaded provisions for 2 full years at sea, more than 400,000 pounds of ship's biscuit, 100,000 pounds of salted beef and pork, 90,000 pounds of beans and chickpeas, thousands of gallons of wine, and countless other stores. The fate of his entire expedition, his quest for a western route to the Spice Islands, rested on these numbers. If his calculations were wrong, his men would starve in the middle of an ocean the size of which he couldn't even guess. Of course, all these carefully packed provisions faced a constant, nibbling threat. The holds of these ships were overrun with rats and mice capable of spoiling vast quantities of food. To combat this, nearly every ship had a vital, furry crew member, the ship's cat. These cats were not pets. They were essential personnel, tireless hunters tasked with protecting the food supply. Some captains took them so seriously they were officially listed on the ship's muster roll, their importance ranked right alongside the human sailors. A good mouser was considered a sign of a lucky ship. Historians still argue about the true motivations for the Age of Discovery. While the desire for spices and gold is well documented, God, gold, and glory, Some scholars emphasize the role of intense national rivalries and the sheer scientific curiosity of the Renaissance as equally powerful driving forces. But whatever the ultimate reason a captain and crew were willing to risk their lives on the open ocean, one fact was universal. No voyage of discovery could begin, no quest for glory or gold could be launched, until the last barrel of salt pork was stowed, the hatches were sealed, and the ship was ready to face the long, quiet journey ahead. That ship, loaded with the ambitions of a nation and the lives of its crew, finally catches the wind and sails toward the horizon. But before its journey could truly begin, its very lifeblood had to be created and secured back on the shore, not by captains or cartographers, but by artisans whose names are lost to history. The success of a multi-year voyage across the globe depended entirely on the integrity of a wooden barrel. So let's step back from the departing ship for a moment, into the noise and sawdust of a dockside workshop, to witness the quiet, crucial artistry that made it all possible. You are in a cooperage, the workshop of a master barrel maker, a cooper. The air is warm and alive with the clean, sharp scent of freshly worked oak. It's a loud place. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of mallets striking wood provides a constant beat, punctuated by the high-pitched ring of hammers on iron hoops and the hiss of steam from a nearby boiler. Sawdust coats everything in a fine, pale dust that catches the light slanting through the open door. This is where the simple, essential technology of the Voyage is born. The barrel is not just a container. It is a meticulously engineered vessel, designed to protect its precious contents from leakage, contamination, and the crushing pressures in the hold of a pitching ship. You watch a master cooper at work. He is not a brute, but a craftsman of immense skill. He begins by selecting his staves, the long curved planks that will form the body of the barrel. They must be made of strong, close-grained oak, perfectly seasoned and free of knots or flaws that could later cause a leak. With a series of specialized, beautiful tools, an adze for shaping the ends, a draw knife for smoothing the surfaces, he bevels the edges of each stave with geometric precision, ensuring they will fit together to form a perfect, watertight seal. Then comes the magic. The staves are set up on end, arranged in a loose circle and held by a temporary hoop. This raw, splayed-out form is then placed over a small fire or a steam vent. As the wood heats up, it becomes pliable. The cooper works quickly using a winch and cables to pull the staves together into that classic bulging shape, hammering the heavy iron hoops down from the top to lock the entire structure into a state of permanent, powerful tension. The skill of these men was so vital that they were among the most respected and well-paid artisans in any city. In places like London, the Worshipful Company of Coopers was a powerful guild, receiving its royal charter way back in 1440. They understood that nearly all global commerce floated on their work. Wine, beer, oil, gunpowder, water, and most importantly for our story, salted meat. It all traveled in barrels. A poorly made barrel wasn't just a mistake. It was a potential catastrophe that could lead to spoiled food, thirsty sailors, and the failure of an entire expedition. Once the barrel is constructed, perfectly curved and strong, the packers take over. Inside the workshop or in an adjacent yard, the meat is being prepared. It's not the finest cut. You see great slabs of fatty pork belly, shoulders, and pieces from the back, what sailors would come to call sow belly, or less affectionately, salt horse. The fat is crucial. On a long, arduous voyage, fat meant calories, and calories meant energy and warmth. Lean meat was less useful. The pieces are trimmed to size and are ready for the cure. Sometimes they are packed in dry salt, but for naval provisions, a wet brine was more common. You watch as a worker prepares the brine in a massive vat. The recipe is simple: water and salt. But how do you know when you've added enough salt? There are no hydrometers, no scientific instruments. Instead, you use a beautifully simple and practical test. The worker drops a fresh egg or a potato into the brine. If it sinks, the solution is too weak. He adds more salt, stirring with a long wooden paddle, until the egg bobs to the surface and floats, its top just breaking the water. A brine that can float an egg is salty enough to preserve meat for years. Food historians still argue about the subtle regional differences in curing recipes and their effects. For example, whether the addition of saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, was a widespread practice in these naval provisions. Saltpeter would help the meat retain a pinkish, more appetizing color and inhibit certain bacteria, but its use was inconsistent. The process is now a swift ballet of production. A layer of coarse salt is thrown into the bottom of the new barrel. Then the packers, their hands raw from the brine, begin forcing the pieces of pork down into the barrel, packing them as tightly as humanly possible to eliminate air pockets. Salt is sprinkled between the layers. Finally, the barrel is topped off with the egg-floating brine. The cooper returns to fit the head, the lid of the barrel. He hammers it carefully into place, fitting it into a groove called a crow's, and drives the final hoop down to seal it. To be absolutely sure of his work, he might perform a final test, using a bellows to pump air into the sealed barrel through the bunghole and brushing the seams with soapy water, watching for the telltale bubbles that would reveal a leak. It's a technique you'd recognize today for finding a puncture in a tire. The barrel is now finished, a complete self-contained world of preservation. It is branded with the mark of the supplier and the date, and rolled out onto the docks ready to begin its long, quiet journey in the dark of the hold. The barrel, a perfect self-contained world of preservation, is rolled into the dark, cavernous hold of the ship. It settles among hundreds of identical siblings, a silent army of provisions. The hatch is sealed, the anchor is weighed, and the great journey begins. Now let's leave the shore behind completely. Months have passed. The memory of land is a faint, sweet dream. The world has shrunk to the creaking wood, the straining canvas, and the endless, indifferent blue of the ocean. You are a sailor, and your life is a study in monotony. You wake, not to the sun, but to the sharp ring of the ship's bell and a boatswain's mate shouting you out of your hammock. The air below decks is thick enough to chew. It is a foul cocktail of smells. The sour rot of bilge water sloshing just beneath the floorboards, the sweat of 100 unwashed men, the faint, acrid smell of animal dung from the livestock pens, and the ever-present damp, musty odor of the ship itself. It is a world of perpetual twilight, dampness, and noise. The groan and creak of the ship's timbers is the constant soundtrack to your existence, a wooden giant complaining in its sleep. You have learned to walk with a permanent sea sway in your legs, your body constantly adjusting to the roll and pitch of your small, floating world. Your life is governed by a strict routine. 4 hours on watch, 4 hours off. During your watch, you haul ropes until your hands are raw. You climb the dizzying heights of the rigging to furl sails. You scrub the decks. You take your turn at the helm. During your time off, you mend your clothes. You try to sleep in a cramped and swinging hammock, and you wait for the one event that breaks the day into manageable pieces. Your meal. You are assigned to a mess of 6 other sailors. You don't have individual plates and cutlery. Your mess has a wooden platter and a shared pot, and that is where you will receive your daily ration. At the designated time, the ship's cook, a grizzled, one-legged man who is more butcher than chef, presides over the distribution. You get your daily pound of ship's biscuit, the hardtack you saw being made. You take your piece and give it a sharp rap against the edge of the table. A few small white weevils fall out. You brush them away without a second thought. Better to see them and get rid of them than to eat them in the dark. The sailors have a dozen names for the biscuit: molar breakers, sheet iron, worm castles. Then comes the drink, a measured ration of beer, or more likely, watered-down rum known as grog. And finally, the main event. A sailor from your mess is sent to the galley with a bucket to collect your portion of boiled salt pork. The journey of that pork from the barrel to your bowl is a ritual in itself. Earlier in the day, the designated piece for the crew was hoisted out of its barrel in the hold, pale and coated in a greasy slime from the brine. It is so intensely salty that eating it straight would be impossible. The common practice is to tie a rope around it and tow it in the ship. Swake for an hour or so, letting the ocean wash away the outer layer of grime and salt. Then it's brought to the galley, which is little more than a brick-lined firebox on the main deck, designed to contain the flames. Here it is chopped up and thrown into a great cauldron of boiling water. Sometimes, to make a one-pot meal, handfuls of the broken, weevil-purged biscuit are thrown in as well, where they soften into a mushy, starchy thickener. The resulting stew is known as lobscouse. When you finally get your share spooned onto your mess's platter, it is a greasy, gray, and profoundly unappetizing sight. You tear off a piece of the pork with your fingers. The texture is stringy and chewy, the fat is soft and gelatinous. And the taste is salt. It is an overwhelming, aggressive saltiness that floods your senses, a flavor so powerful it eclipses everything else. You eat it quickly, using your biscuit to sop up the greasy broth. This is not food for enjoyment. This is fuel and nothing more. The official ration on a Royal Navy ship in this era was well documented: a pound of biscuit and a gallon of beer per day, with salt pork and salt beef served on alternating days. But maritime historians still argue about the actual enforcement of these official scales, as corruption and spoilage often meant the common sailor received far less than what was promised on paper. The true hardship was the sheer soul-crushing monotony. You eat salt pork and biscuit on Tuesday. On Wednesday, you eat salt beef and biscuit. On Thursday, salt pork again. And so it goes, for weeks, months, sometimes years. The only break would be a rare treat, like a fish caught by a lucky sailor or a flying fish that happened to land on deck. The fat that was skimmed off the top of the boiling cauldron was called slush. The cook would collect this in a barrel, and it was his perk to sell it to candle and soap makers when the ship reached port. This greasy, profitable side hustle gave us the modern term slush fund. For you, the common sailor, there is no fund. There is only the daily confrontation with the same salty meat, a food that keeps your body alive while slowly deadening your spirit on the longest, quietest journey of your life. The salt pork fills your belly. The hardtack gives you something to chew on. The grog warms you for a moment against the damp chill of the sea. This diet, this monotonous cycle of salt and starch, will keep you from starving. It provides the raw calories needed to haul the ropes and climb the masts. But it is a hollow, empty energy. It sustains the body's fire but fails to repair its foundations. And so after months at sea, a shadow begins to fall over the crew, a malady more feared than a Spanish cannonade or a Caribbean hurricane. It was known as the scourge of the seas, a mysterious and terrifying disease that was the single greatest killer of sailors for centuries. This specter was scurvy. It begins subtly. At first, you just feel a profound weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep cannot fix. Your joints ache. You feel a strange and persistent sadness, a melancholy that you chalk up to the endless sea and the longing for home. Indeed, for centuries, many believed that a powerful homesickness or nostalgia was a primary cause of the disease. This quirky tidbit highlights the desperation to find a cause for the suffering, a belief that if a man could just see green fields again, his body would heal itself. Of course, the land held the cure, but not in the way they imagined. You ignore the early signs, forcing yourself through your duties, thinking it's just the hardship of the voyage taking its toll. But then, the symptoms become impossible to ignore. It starts in your mouth. Your gums feel tender, then they begin to swell, turning a dark, purplish color. They become spongy to the touch and bleed whenever you try to chew your hard biscuit. Soon, your teeth, which have been perfectly healthy your whole life, begin to feel loose in their sockets. You can wiggle them with your tongue. Eventually, they fall out one by one, leaving you with a bloody, painful maw. Your breath takes on a foul, putrid odor. The simple act of eating becomes an agony. The disease continues its relentless work on your body. Dark, ugly bruises like spilled ink bloom across your skin on your legs and arms, even from the slightest bump. These are not normal bruises. They are signs of spontaneous bleeding under the skin. And then comes the most terrifying and surreal symptom of all. An old scar on your forearm, from a knife fight 10 years ago in a tavern. A wound that had healed to a thin white line begins to ache. You look down to see it has turned dark and angry. The skin breaks open, and the old wound reappears raw and weeping as if the injury had just happened. Your body is not just failing to heal new wounds, it is actively unhealing old ones. It is forgetting how to be whole. For centuries, no one understood that this horror was the result of a simple dietary deficiency. The sailor's ration of salt pork, beef, and biscuit was completely devoid of what we now know as vitamin C, or ascorbic acid. In the simplest terms, vitamin C is essential for your body to produce and maintain collagen. Collagen is the glue of the human body. It's the primary protein in your skin, your blood vessels, your bones, and all your connective tissues. Without a constant supply of vitamin C, your body can no longer manufacture this glue. Your blood vessels become brittle and leak, causing the bruising and internal hemorrhaging. Your skin loses its integrity. Your bones weaken. Your body literally begins to fall apart at a molecular level. The breakthrough came in 1747, thanks to a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind. Aboard the HMS Salisbury, he conducted what is now recognized as one of the first controlled clinical trials in history. He took 12 sailors suffering horribly from scurvy and divided them into 6 pairs. All 12 received the same basic diet, but each pair was given a different daily supplement. One pair got a quart of cider, another got drops of sulfuric acid, a third got vinegar, a fourth got seawater, a fifth got a medicinal paste of garlic and mustard seed, and the final pair was given 2 oranges and 1 lemon. The results were dramatic and undeniable. The men on the citrus fruit made a stunningly fast recovery. Within a week, they were healthy enough to be nursing the others. Lind had found the cure. It is a mainstream historical fact that despite the clarity of Lind's results, it took the British Admiralty nearly 50 years to make lemon or lime juice a standard issue for sailors. Historians still argue about why the Royal Navy took so long to adopt Lind's findings. Was it due to bureaucratic inertia? The logistical challenge and expense of supplying citrus for the entire fleet? Or a genuine scientific skepticism and debate among the medical establishment of the time? Whatever the reason, for another 2 generations, sailors continued to suffer and die from a preventable disease. The barrels of salt pork kept them from starving, but they were haunted by the ghost of the fresh food that had been left behind. Their long, quiet journey through the empty ocean, a slow-motion process of coming undone. The ship, haunted by the specter of scurvy, finally makes landfall. The long, terrifying journey across the ocean is over. You have survived. But as you step onto the alien shore of the New World, the humid, heavy air of Virginia filling your lungs, you realize the journey has only entered a new phase. You have left the confinement of the ship, but you are now marooned on the edge of a vast, unknown continent, and your reliance on that simple, salty food in the barrel has not ended. In fact, you will come to learn that it is more critical than ever. You are standing in the crude, palisaded fort of Jamestown in the early 17th century. This is not the land of gold and easy living that was described in the pamphlets back in London. The reality is a sweltering, swampy wilderness, buzzing with insects you've never seen before. The forest is not a familiar English wood. It is a dense, intimidating wall of green, hiding unknown animals, unknown people, and unknown dangers. The handful of colonists around you are a mix of gentlemen who have never worked a day in their lives, soldiers expecting a quick conquest, and craftsmen whose skills are of little use in carving a settlement from scratch. You are all profoundly unprepared. The plan, such as it was to rely on the provisions you brought with you, those familiar barrels of salt pork, casks of flour and dried peas, while you traded with the native Powhatan people for fresh corn and game, or waited for the next supply ship from England. But the ships are delayed. The trading relationship with the Powhatan is fraught with misunderstanding and mistrust, quickly souring into hostility, and the gentlemen adventurers who consider farming to be beneath them have failed to plant enough crops to sustain the colony. Historians still argue about the primary cause of Jamestown's initial failures. Was it the hostile environment and devastating droughts, poor leadership and planning by the Virginia Company, the colonists' own lack of survival skills, or the complex and often antagonistic relationship with the native Powhatan people? Whatever the combination of causes, the result was a catastrophe. The initial supplies dwindled and then disappeared. The winter of 1609 to 1610 descended upon the starving, desperate colony. This period would go down in history with a chilling name: the Starving Time. With no reserves of salt pork or grain, the settlers were forced to eat anything they could find. They ate their horses, then dogs and cats, then rats and mice. They boiled the leather from their shoes and belts to create a wretched, gluey broth. And when all that was gone, they resorted to the ultimate taboo. Archaeological evidence has confirmed the grim tales. The starving colonists turned to cannibalism, digging up fresh graves to consume the dead. This mainstream historical fact is a brutal testament to how close the first permanent English settlement in America came to total collapse. By the spring, of the 500 colonists who had started the winter, only 60 remained. The lesson of the starving time was burned into the consciousness of colonial America. The dream of a quick and easy paradise was dead. Survival would be a long, hard-fought battle, and the most important weapon in that battle was a secure food supply. In the wake of the disaster, the importance of preserved foods like salt pork became paramount. It was the ultimate insurance policy, a buffer between a bad harvest or a delayed supply ship and total annihilation. It was the food you could count on when everything else failed. And so raising pigs became a top priority. And the pigs, it turned out, were even better suited to this new continent than the colonists were. Turned loose into the vast, temperate forests, they thrived. They foraged on acorns, roots, and hickory nuts, fattening themselves with little effort from their owners, a perfect echo of the medieval practice of pannage. They reproduced quickly and were incredibly hardy. Some escaped and went feral, creating a uniquely American animal, the razorback hog. These descendants of domestic pigs became leaner, tougher, and fiercely aggressive, a permanent feature of the southern backcountry, and a testament to the pigs' incredible adaptability. As the colonies stabilized and grew, salt pork transformed from a mere survival ration into a cornerstone of the colonial economy. The forests of New England and the Carolinas supported enormous herds of swine. A new industry, mimicking the one you saw on the docks of Seville, sprung up on the shores of Boston and Charleston. Colonists were not just packing pork for their own winter survival, they were packing it for export. Barrels of American salt pork became a vital trade commodity, shipped down to the rich sugar plantations of the West Indies to feed the enslaved workforce there. It was a crucial link in a complex and growing transatlantic economy. The humble barrel of pork which had saved the starving colonists was now helping to build their fortunes, one salty, profitable piece at a time. The barrel of salt pork has become a commodity, a building block of a new colonial economy. You've seen how it helped the fledgling settlements in North America survive and then thrive, to the point where they are producing a surplus. But a surplus of any good needs a market, a place for it to be sold, and the largest, most voracious market for this cheap, durable, calorie-dense food was to the south, in the islands of the Caribbean. As we follow the barrels of salt pork from the ports of Boston and Charleston on their journey south, our story takes a much darker turn. For here, this simple food becomes an essential cog in the monstrous world-spanning machine of the triangle trade and the institution of slavery. To understand this, you have to understand the cold, brutal economics that powered the 18th century Atlantic world. The engine of this economy was sugar. Grown on vast plantations in places like Jamaica, Barbados, and Haiti, sugar was the oil of its day, a product of immense profitability that fueled an insatiable European demand. To grow sugar requires vast amounts of land and punishing manual labor. The plantation owners, in their single-minded pursuit of profit, dedicated every square inch of their valuable land to growing sugar cane. This created a problem. They were not growing food to feed the massive workforce of enslaved African people who performed the back-breaking labor. To solve this, they imported the cheapest, most calorie-dense food they could find, and that food came from the North American colonies. This is the grim logic of the system, the salt pork. And salt cod produced in New England became the fuel that sustained the enslaved laborers on the sugar islands. The journey begins on the second and most infamous leg of the triangle trade, the Middle Passage. You are now an unwilling observer on the deck of a slave ship. Below you, in a space so cramped that people cannot stand, hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children are chained together in darkness and filth. The voyage across the Atlantic could last for months, and the conditions were a living hell of disease, dehydration, and despair. Feeding this human cargo was a cold calculation for the ship's captain. The goal was not to provide nutrition, but to minimize mortality just enough to protect the investment. The diet was a monotonous, starchy gruel, usually made from horse beans, yams, or rice, boiled in a giant copper cauldron. To this foul-smelling mush, a small amount of salted beef, fish, or pork might be added for a hint of protein. It was barely enough to sustain life. The dehumanization was total. If a captive, out of grief or defiance, refused to eat, they were not allowed to starve. The ship's surgeon would employ a horrifying device called a speculum aurum, a scissor-like instrument that was used to force the person's jaws open so that the gruel could be funneled down their throat. This was not an act of mercy. It was the same logic a farmer might use to force-feed a sick animal. It was a business decision to preserve the value of the commodity. The salt pork, in this context, is no longer a food of survival. It is an instrument of control, a measured input designed to keep a human machine functioning until it could be sold. When the ships arrived in the Caribbean, the survivors of the Middle Passage were sold at auction and sent to the sugar plantations. Here, their lives were governed by the relentless rhythm of the cane harvest and the meager rations provided by the plantation owner. Once a week there would be a distribution of food. You would see the enslaved people line up to receive their allowance, a large measure of cornmeal or yams, and a small, pathetic-looking piece of salt pork or dried salt cod from North America. This single salty scrap of meat was meant to last an entire family for a full week. It was used as a seasoning, a way to add a little flavor and a few precious calories to the daily pot of corn mush. This was the final destination for all those barrels you saw being packed on the docks of colonial America. This diet, designed by the plantation owners, was intentionally deficient. It provided just enough energy for a person to work in the fields, but not enough for them to truly thrive. However, within this brutal system of control, people found ways to resist and assert their humanity. Historians still argue about the degree to which enslaved people were able to supplement their meager rations. While the plantation system was designed for total control, evidence from archaeology and personal accounts suggests that many cultivated small personal gardens late at night, growing vegetables and greens. They would fish in the island streams or set traps for small animals. These acts of self-provisioning were not just about improving nutrition, they were acts of agency, a declaration that their bodies and their lives were their own. So the simple, salty history of our food has now carried us into the heart of a great historical crime. The same food that fueled Roman legions, enabled Viking explorers, and saved Jamestown colonists was now fundamentally integrated into a system of human exploitation. The barrel of pork is no longer just a symbol of human ingenuity and the struggle for survival. It is now freighted with a much more complex and sorrowful legacy, a testament to the way even the most basic of human necessities can be woven into systems of profound injustice. The story of salt pork has carried us into the dark economic heart of the 18th century Atlantic. We've seen it become a fuel for the engine of slavery, a mundane commodity in a system of immense cruelty. But the very merchant ships that carried these barrels of pork and the sugar they sustained became targets. The sea lanes of the triangle trade were prowled by predators, by men who operated under their own flag, the skull and crossbones. And as we shift our perspective to the deck of a pirate sloop during the golden age of piracy, you'll see that for these outlaws, treasure didn't always glitter. Sometimes it came packed in brine. You'll be left behind the brutal discipline of the Royal Navy or the miserable pay of a merchant ship. You are now a brother of the coast, a pirate, and your life is one of violent freedom. It's a short life, most likely, but it is lived on your own terms. Many of your crewmates are here for the same reason. They are rebels against the very conditions we've already explored. They are tired of the worm-eaten biscuits, the stingy rations of salty meat, the lash of the boatswain, and the shadow of scurvy. On this ship you have a vote, a share of the prize, and a right to your daily portion. This was the promise of the pirate life. This brief explosive period, roughly from the 1690s to the 1720s, is known as the Golden Age of Piracy. And you are right in the middle of it, cruising the warm blue waters of the Caribbean. A lookout cries from the masthead, "Sail, ho!" It's a fat, slow-moving merchantman, low in the water, heavy with cargo. Your captain, a fearsome figure like Blackbeard or Calico Jack, gives the order to run up the Jolly Roger and give chase. The goal is not to sink the vessel, but to capture it and its contents. And what are you truly after? Your mind might leap to chests of Spanish doubloons and pieces of eight, and while that was the ultimate jackpot, the reality of pirate plunder was usually far more practical. The grappling hooks fly, your crew swarms over the rails, and after a brief, brutal fight, the ship is yours. The first priority is to secure the prize. But what is the most valuable part of it? Before you even look for the captain's strongbox, you head for the ship's manifest in the cargo hold. The true treasure, the stuff that will allow you to continue your life of freedom, is the provisions. A hold full of barrels of salt pork is a victory. Casks of wine and rum are a cause for celebration. Sacks of flour, cannons, gunpowder, spare sails, rope, and medicine. This is the real booty. Gold is wonderful, but you can't eat it, and you can't use it to repair your ship in the middle of the ocean. Salt pork is life. It is the resource that allows you to extend your voyage, to stay at sea and out of reach of the naval squadrons hunting you. Of course, once a prize was taken, it was time for a feast. The first thing you would do is liberate any fresh food on board. The merchant ship would have live chickens, perhaps a goat or a pig for the captain's table. These were immediately slaughtered and cooked. You would raid the captain's personal larder for his fine wines, his cheeses, his fresh vegetables. For a few days, you would eat like kings. A favorite celebratory dish of this era was a chaotic, magnificent creation called salmagundi. It was the ultimate expression of plunder on a plate. There was no set recipe. The ship's cook would simply take everything good he could find: chopped boiled turtle meat, salted pork, anchovies, hard-boiled eggs, pickled onions, mangoes, grapes, and throw it all together in a great heap, drenched in spiced oil and vinegar. It was a messy, glorious, and defiant feast. But the party never lasted. The fresh food would be consumed in a matter of days. And what were you left with? The same old story: salt pork and hardtack. The difference, however, was crucial. On a pirate ship, the food was distributed according to the articles, the pirate code that you all signed and swore an oath upon. These articles guaranteed a fair and equal share for every man. The captain did not get a better meal than the newest recruit. This radical democracy was a direct rejection of the rigid hierarchy of the naval and merchant world, where officers dined well while the crew starved. Historians still argue about the primary motivations of pirates. Were they simply criminals, or did they represent a form of social rebellion, creating a floating democratic society? The way they shared their food is often used as powerful evidence for the latter. This egalitarian approach meant that while the diet was monotonous, it was at least plentiful and fairly distributed. There was no stingy purser trying to short your ration to save money. The slush fund we talked about earlier didn't exist here. Any byproduct belonged to the whole crew. Furthermore, pirates had more opportunity to supplement their diet. You might pull into a deserted cove to careen your ship, and while there, you would hunt the wild pigs that roamed many Caribbean islands, the feral descendants of the very pigs brought over by the Spanish. You would catch sea turtles, a great delicacy, and gather fresh fruit. For the pirate, then, salt pork existed in a strange duality. It was both the boring daily grind of survival, and it was a form of treasure in itself, the plundered provision that made your entire life of rebellion possible. The golden age of piracy eventually gutters and dies out, its rebellious energy crushed by the organized might of the Royal Navy. But that spirit of rebellion against distant, powerful masters did not vanish from the Atlantic world. A few decades later, it has flared up again, no longer confined to a few renegade ships, but now burning across 13 colonies in North America. A revolution has begun, and as you trade your pirate's cutlass for a Continental Army musket, you will find that the grand struggle for independence is once again at the mercy of a very old and very stubborn problem: the simple, agonizing logistics of food. The year is 1777. The early patriotic fervor of the war has faded, replaced by a grim, weary reality. You are a soldier in General George Washington's Continental Army. After a string of defeats, you are marching, leaving bloody footprints in the snow from your worn-out shoes, towards your designated winter encampment. The place is called Valley Forge. It is not a battlefield, but it will become one of the most crucial and terrible grounds of the entire war. Here you will not fight the British. You will fight a far more insidious enemy: hunger, disease, and the slow, creeping despair of a forgotten army. The Continental Army is not the well-oiled machine of the British Empire. It is a fragile, underfunded, and disorganized force. The Continental Congress, your new government, has no real power to levy taxes, so it is constantly short on hard currency to buy supplies. The Army's commissary department is a tangled mess of inefficiency and corruption. Farmers and merchants, often unpaid for their goods, prefer to sell to the British, who pay in gold. And so, as you and 12,000 of your comrades arrive at Valley Forge, you are arriving at the brink of a logistical collapse. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of the British blockade and its role in this crisis. Was the failure primarily internal, due to American incompetence, or was it a direct result of the British Army's successful strategy of disrupting supply lines? For you, a common soldier, the academic debate means nothing. What you know is the cold and the hunger. Your first task is to build your own shelter, a crude log hut with a smoking fireplace, which you will share with a dozen other men. Your uniform is a collection of rags. Your shoes, if you ever had any, have disintegrated. You might have one thin, threadbare blanket to protect you from the Pennsylvania winter. And the hunger is a constant, gnawing presence in your belly. The official ration is supposed to be a daily portion of meat, usually salted pork or beef, along with bread, peas, and beer. But this is a fantasy. The supply wagons are nowhere to be seen. Days and then weeks go by with almost no food arriving. Your diet shrinks to a single miserable item, fire cake. It is a pathetic paste of flour and water, which you cook on a rock heated in the fire. It is gritty, tasteless, and barely provides enough energy to keep you alive. You watch as your comrades grow weaker. The camps are filthy. Disease, typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, sweeps through the crowded huts, killing far more men than British bullets ever did. Of the 12,000 soldiers who staggered into Valley Forge that winter, nearly 2,000 will die there from starvation and sickness. General Washington, in a desperate attempt to combat the waves of disease, issued surprisingly detailed orders about sanitation. He specified the exact location of the latrines or necessaries and ordered that they be covered with fresh earth every day. He even had the men daub their huts inside and out with a thick layer of clay to seal the cracks against the wind, a small measure against the killing cold. But all the discipline in the world cannot fix a starving army. When a supply wagon finally does get through, it is a cause for delirious celebration. The prize is almost always the same: barrels of salt pork and sacks of flour. The barrels are broken open, and the men descend on the salty, fatty meat like wolves. It is a taste of salvation. But sometimes the prize is a cruel joke. The barrels, perhaps made by a shoddy cooper, have leaked. The brine is gone and the pork inside is rotten, green with mold. You are faced with a terrible choice: eat the putrid meat and risk getting violently ill, or continue to starve. This is the reality of the war for independence. A war that feels less like a glorious revolution and more like a slow, agonizing wait for a barrel of pork that may or may not be spoiled. The Army was on the verge of dissolving. Washington wrote desperate letters to Congress, warning that if supplies did not arrive, the revolution would be lost. And then, slowly, things began to change. A Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, arrived and began drilling the men, forging them into a disciplined fighting force. And crucially, in the spring, Washington appointed a brilliant new quartermaster general, Nathaniel Greene. Greene untangled the logistical nightmare, reformed the supply lines, and got the wagons moving. The barrels of salt pork, beef, and flour began to arrive regularly. The Army, though scarred and thinned, survived the winter. It was a victory born not of battle, but of endurance, a testament to the soldiers who held on through the darkest of times, waiting for the simple, salty promise of a meal. The Continental Army, forged in the crucible of Valley Forge, goes on to win its independence. A new nation is born, free and ambitious. And as the 19th century dawns, this young United States turns its energy outward, not for conquest, but for commerce. A new kind of long, quiet journey begins, one that will last longer, go farther, and push the limits of human endurance in a way no military campaign or voyage of discovery ever had before. You are heading back to sea, not as a soldier or an explorer, but as a hunter, a factory worker, and a mariner, all in one. You are signing on to a whaling ship. You stand on the docks of New Bedford, Massachusetts, the bustling center of a global industry. The ship before you is a stout three-masted vessel, built not for speed but for capacity and resilience. It smells of brine, tar, and something else. A deep, heavy, musky odor that you will come to know intimately. The smell of rendered whale oil. You sign the ship's articles not for a single crossing or a season but for the entire voyage. And a whaling voyage has no set end date. You will be at sea for 3, 4, maybe even 5 years. You will not return until the hold is filled with barrels of precious whale oil, the substance that lights the lamps and lubricates the machines of the Industrial Revolution. This incredible duration presents the ultimate challenge in provisioning. The ship is a self-contained town, a floating factory that must carry everything it needs for half a decade. The hold is packed to the bursting point with the familiar trinity. Casks of fresh water are wedged in alongside mountains of hardtack stored in bread rooms. And of course there are barrels upon barrels of salt pork and salt beef, the protein that will have to sustain you for years on end. The sheer quantity is staggering. It is a multi-year supply of the most durable food ever invented, a hedge against the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. Life aboard a whaler is a strange paradox of intense, soul-crushing boredom and moments of sheer heart-pounding terror. For months you might drift across the empty expanse of the ocean, seeing nothing but water and sky. The days blur into an endless cycle of watches, of mending sails and scrubbing decks. The monotony is a physical presence, a thick, heavy blanket that smothers the spirit. Then, the cry from the lookout, "Thar she blows!" And in an instant, the ship explodes into frantic, disciplined action. The whale boats are lowered and you are suddenly in a tiny, fragile craft, rowing for your life, chasing a creature the size of a building. A creature that can smash your boat to splinters with a single flick of its massive tail. But most of your life is not the hunt. Most of your life is the waiting. And the thing that marks the slow, agonizing passage of time more than anything else is the food. It is the same diet of the 18th century sailor, but now stretched out over an almost unimaginable time frame. After 2 years at sea, the hardtack is no longer just weevily. It is a moving, porous mass of insect life. You get used to it. You might adopt the whaler's trick of placing your biscuit on your hot tin cup of coffee. In theory, the heat drives the weevils out of their tunnels. You can then blow them away before you take a bite, a little ritual known as heating the bugs out. The salt pork, after 3 or 4 years in its barrel, is a scientific curiosity. It is hard as mahogany, rust-colored from the brine, and possessed of a saltiness so profound it feels like it's scouring your tongue. There is no joy in it. There is no comfort. It is fuel in its crudest, most basic form. The only break from this routine comes after a successful hunt. While most of the whale was used for oil and bone, the crew would sometimes harvest certain parts for a rare, fresh meal. A whale steak might be cut from the tail flukes, or the massive brain might be scrambled with bits of biscuit. But by all accounts, these were not great delicacies. Whale meat was dark, oily, and had a strong, fishy taste. It was eaten not because it was good, but because it was different. Historians and literary scholars, especially those studying Herman Melville's masterpiece, Moby Dick, still argue about the psychological profile of the men who chose the whaling life. Were they simply desperate men seeking any form of employment? Or were they a unique breed of adventurers and outcasts, drawn to the ultimate frontier of the open ocean? The ability to mentally endure the years of isolation and the relentless, unchanging diet is a huge part of that question. The food itself became a form of psychological torture. It was a daily, greasy reminder of how many years you had been gone, and how many more you might have to go. The sameness of it wore you down, a constant, tasteless anchor to your lonely reality. On the long, quiet, and profoundly isolated journey of the 19th century whaler, the greatest monster was not always the great white whale, but the simple salty pork that awaited you day after day in the darkness of the hold. While the blubber hunters of New England were pushing the frontiers of human endurance on the vast, lonely oceans of the world, another great American journey was unfolding back on the continent. At the very same time that sailors were spending years chasing whales in the Pacific, a different kind of pioneer was chasing a different kind of dream, heading not out to sea but deep into the heart of the land. The cry was not "Thar she blows," but "Westward ho." And as you trade the greasy deck of a whaler for the dusty canvas cover of a prairie schooner, you will find that this new epic journey is once again powered by the simple, salty magic of preserved pork. You are in St. Joseph, Missouri, in the spring of 1850. The town is a chaotic, bustling hub of preparation and departure. It is a jumping-off point for the great overland trails, and the air is electric with a mixture of hope and anxiety. You are part of a family that has sold your farm, packed your meager belongings, and staked your entire future on the promise of a new life in the Oregon country, 2,000 miles away. Your entire world must now fit into a single, sturdy, canvas-covered Conestoga wagon. It is not a home, it is a supply vessel for a 6-month trek across a wilderness of prairie, desert, and mountains. The provisioning of this wagon is the most important task you will undertake. There are no stores, no inns, no farms where you are going. Everything you will need to survive the journey must be loaded right here, right now. Guidebooks of the era give strict, detailed lists. For each adult, you must pack hundreds of pounds of flour, cornmeal, beans, sugar, coffee, and of course the primary source of meat, bacon or salt pork. Over 100 pounds of it per person. The wagon is not filled with furniture and keepsakes, it is filled with food. It is a pantry on wheels, a land-bound version of the barrels in a ship's hold. And then, the journey begins. You join a long, slow-moving train of wagons, a river of humanity flowing west. The reality of the trail is not a thrilling adventure. It is a job of relentless grinding work. You do not ride in the wagon. That space is for the precious supplies. You walk. You walk beside the lumbering oxen, 10, 15, maybe 20 miles a day if you're lucky, your feet aching and your face coated in a fine layer of dust. The daily routine is brutal. You rise before the sun, yoke the oxen, walk all day under the vast empty sky, and then, as evening falls, the wagons circle up, and you make camp for the night. This is the moment you have been waiting for. The campfire is the heart of your temporary mobile village. It is the place of warmth, community, and the promise of a hot meal. And the smell that defines the evening on the Oregon Trail is the sharp, savory aroma of salt pork frying in a cast-iron skillet. You slice off several thick pieces from the slab of cured bacon and lay them in the pan. The sizzle and pop is the most beautiful sound in the world after a day of silence and plodding footsteps. The fat renders out, creating a pool of liquid gold. This grease is a precious resource, almost as valuable as the meat itself. You eat the crispy, salty pieces of pork, a burst of flavor and energy that seems to revive your very soul. Then, you use the hot grease in the skillet to cook your bread. It's a simple, unleavened dough of flour, water, and salt, which you pat into a flat cake and fry in the bacon fat until it's golden brown and cooked through. This skillet bread, sometimes called bannock, is heavy, greasy, and utterly delicious. It is the perfect vehicle for soaking up every last drop of flavor from the pan. This meal, fried salt pork and greasy bread, washed down with black coffee, is the fuel that repairs the damage of the day and gives you the strength to face the next. The sheer difficulty of the journey is written on the landscape. The trail is littered with the ghosts of other people's dreams. You pass by abandoned furniture, heavy dressers, ornate chairs, even pianos, items that families could not bear to part with back in Missouri, but were forced to discard to lighten their wagon's load before a steep mountain pass or a difficult river crossing. These sad relics were known as prairie furniture. You would see a family heirloom half buried in the dust, but you would never see a discarded slab of bacon. The priorities out here were stark and simple. You need food to live. Everything else is a luxury. Historians still argue about the primary motivations of the pioneers. Was it Oregon fever, economic hardship, or the ideology of manifest destiny? For you, on the trail, the motivation is simpler: to get your family and your wagon of provisions safely to the green valleys of the West. And while the number one killer on the trail was disease like cholera, the number one fear was running out of food. In the vast, quiet journey across the American continent, the sizzle of salt pork in a pan was the sound of survival. The long, slow journey of the wagon train has carved new paths across the American continent, stitching the nation together with dusty trails of hope and perseverance. But the nation, now stretching from sea to shining sea, is about to turn violently inward. The same decade that saw the peak of the Oregon Trail migration also saw the country unravel into a brutal and bloody civil war. The long, quiet journey of the pioneer is over, replaced by the deafening roar of cannons and the long, terrible marches of armies. You are no longer a pioneer seeking a new home, but a soldier, fighting for the very soul of the country. And you will soon learn that this war, like all wars before it, is fought and won on the stomachs of its soldiers. The year is 1862. Whether you are a Billy Yank fighting for the Union or a Johnny Reb in the Confederate gray, your life has become a routine of drill, march, and the terrifying chaos of battle. But the moments of combat are fleeting. Most of your time is spent waiting, marching, and thinking about your next meal. Feeding the millions of men mobilized for this war was a logistical challenge on an unprecedented scale. Both sides established a standard military ration, and at the heart of both was our old, salty friend. If you are a Union soldier, your official ration is, on paper, one of the most generous of any army in the world. Each day you are entitled to a pound of hardtack, and either a pound and a quarter of fresh beef or 3/4 of a pound of salt pork. You also get beans, rice, sugar, and the most prized commodity of all, coffee. The industrial might of the North, with its sprawling factories and extensive railroad network, meant that these supplies, for the most part, actually reached you. The logistical superiority of the Union was a quiet, decisive factor that would ultimately help win the war. If you are a Confederate soldier, your situation is far more precarious. The official ration looks similar to your Yankee counterparts, but it is often a distant dream. The agrarian South lacked the North's manufacturing base and, crucially, its transportation infrastructure. The ever-tightening Union naval blockade choked off imports. As the war grinds on, your ration shrinks to little more than a pint of cornmeal and a 1/4 pound of bacon or rancid salt pork a day. Coffee is a long-forgotten memory, replaced by bitter brews made from chicory, roasted acorns, or dried sweet potatoes. Civil War historians still argue about the effectiveness of the Confederate Commissary Bureau. Was its chief, Lucius B. Northrop, a hopelessly incompetent leader, or a man doing an impossible job with a collapsing economy and infrastructure? Regardless of the uniform you wear, the food you do get is grimly similar. The bread for both armies is hardtack, the same molar breaker that sailors knew so well. You might call them tooth dullers. They are 3-inch squares of unleavened flour and water, baked to the consistency of slate. To make them edible, you have to break them up with the butt of your rifle, soak them in coffee, or fry them in pork grease. A popular dish is skilly-gully, a foul-sounding but welcome concoction of crumbled hardtack fried in pork fat until it forms a greasy, savory mush. And then there is the meat. When it arrives, it is a slab of intensely salted pork, packed by wartime contractors who were notoriously corrupt, using the lowest quality meat they could find. The soldiers on both sides gave it a new, enduring nickname, Salt Horse. It was tough, stringy, and incredibly greasy, but it was calories and it was protein. You would spear a piece with your bayonet and roast it over the campfire, the melting fat dripping and hissing into the flames. With rations so meager and monotonous, you become an expert at foraging, or as you call it, prospecting. You learn to spot wild onions and berries. You might be lucky enough to liberate a chicken from a nearby farm. A particularly treasured prize was a bee tree. You would watch for bees flying to a hole in a tree, mark the spot, and come back at night with an axe. The reward for your labor and the inevitable stings was a bucket of fresh, golden honey, a taste of impossible sweetness in a world of salt and grease. It was a luxury that could make you forget the war just for a moment. In the end, the shared misery of the daily ration was one of the few things that united the common soldiers of the North and South. While they fought and died for vastly different causes, they were both sustained by the same hard bread and salty meat. A Confederate soldier's dream was to overrun a Union camp not just for the victory, but for the chance to capture their well-stocked supply train. to get a taste of real coffee and a full portion of salt horse. The great tragic conflict that tore the nation apart was, in many ways, a war of attrition, a battle of resources. And it was won by the side that could more reliably get the barrels of salt horse and the crates of hardtack to the front. The cannons of the Civil War fall silent. The nation, though deeply scarred, is once again whole. The great project of the late 19th century now begins. An explosion of industrial growth, the building of great cities, and the laying of thousands of miles of railroad track. All of this expansion requires a staggering amount of raw materials, and one of the most vital is timber, deep in the vast primeval forests of the Great Lakes states and later the Pacific Northwest. A new kind of army is mobilized. They are not soldiers, but they are engaged in a form of conquest, waging a war against the wilderness itself. You've put down your musket and now you pick up an axe. You are a lumberjack. You are in a remote logging camp in the deep woods of Michigan during the golden age of American logging. It is winter, the best time to move heavy logs over the frozen, snowy ground. Your world is a small, isolated camp of crude log bunkhouses, buried in snow and miles from the nearest town. From dawn until dusk, you are engaged in some of the most physically demanding and dangerous work ever devised by man. Your axe bites deep into the trunk of a giant white pine, a tree that has stood here for 2 centuries. The rhythmic thwack of your blade and the rasp of the 2-man crosscut saw are the only sounds in the frozen forest. The air is sharp with the scent of pine and your own sweat, which freezes in the cold. This work requires a phenomenal amount of energy. It's estimated that a 19th century lumberjack, or shanty boy as you are called, burned between 7,000 and 9,000 calories a day. You are a human engine, and an engine requires fuel. The most important man in the entire camp is not the foreman who directs the cutting. It is the cook. A good cook, who could provide an endless supply of hot, high-calorie food, was the key to a productive and peaceful camp. A bad cook or meager portions could lead to slowdowns, fights, or even a full-scale walkout. The cookhouse, or cook shack, is the undisputed center of camp life. But it is a place of strict rules. You file in, exhausted and ravenous after a 10-hour day of back-breaking labor. You find your spot at the long plank tables and you eat. There is no talking. Meal times are for refueling, not socializing. The work is too serious, the need for energy too great. This silence is a fascinating aspect of camp culture. Social historians still argue about the nature of these camps. Were they the wild, individualistic places of Paul Bunyan folklore, or were they highly structured communities bound by shared danger? The rigid etiquette of the cookhouse suggests a more complex, disciplined reality. And the food you eat is the ultimate expression of function over form. It is a diet designed for one purpose: to pack as many calories into your body as possible. You are served mountains of food on thick tin plates. Sourdough pancakes called hotcakes, swimming in molasses for breakfast, massive heavy pies for dessert, and gallons of thick black coffee boiled with the grounds until it is strong enough to dissolve a spoon. But at the heart of every single meal is salt pork. It is the bedrock of the lumberjack diet. For breakfast, you have thick slices of it, fried in a pan and served alongside a heap of potatoes, also fried in the rendered pork fat. For dinner, the centerpiece is a massive pot of baked beans. This isn't the sweet, soupy stuff from a can. This is a legendary camp dish, often cooked using a bean hole. The cook would soak dried beans, then place them in a massive iron pot with a huge chunk of salt pork, molasses, and mustard. He would then dig a pit, fill it with hot coals, bury the pot, and let it cook slowly for the entire day. When you return from the woods, the beans are thick, savory, and rich with melted pork fat. The salt pork provides the protein, but more importantly, it provides the fat. Fat is the most calorie-dense food there is, and it is the high-octane fuel that keeps your internal furnace burning against the cold and powers your muscles. The cook uses the rendered pork grease for everything. He fries the potatoes in it. He adds it to the bread dough. He uses it to make gravy. It is the defining flavor and the essential energy source of the entire camp. The nation's new cities, with their balloon frame houses and endless blocks of development, are rising from the forests of the north. And the power that is felling those forests, the energy that swings the axe and pulls the saw, comes directly from the sizzle of salt pork in a cast-iron pan. The roar of the falling pine tree echoes through the 19th century, a sound of industrial muscle powered by the humble, fatty energy of salt pork. While the lumberjacks were harvesting the green gold of the forests to build the nation, a feverish new dream was taking hold on the other side of the continent. A cry went up from California, a single word that would trigger a human avalanche: gold. And as you drop your axe and pick up a mining pan, you join a frantic, chaotic rush for riches. Another long journey into a remote place where survival once again depends on the most basic, durable provisions. You are a 49er. You have endured a brutal journey to get here, either months walking the overland trail subsisting on that familiar diet of fried bacon and skillet bread, or a perilous sea voyage around Cape Horn where you were reacquainted with the sailor's fare of hardtack and salt horse. You have finally arrived in the gold fields of California, and it is a world of pure, exhilarating chaos. Tents and crude shacks cling to the sides of muddy ravines. The air buzzes with a dozen languages and the constant, hopeful sound of shovels hitting gravel. This is a place stripped down to a single burning desire. The sudden massive influx of people, a mainstream fact, is that California's population exploded from a few thousand to over 100,000 in a single year, created an economy of surreal inflation. With no local farms and a completely overwhelmed supply chain, the price of everyday goods skyrocketed. An egg could cost $1, the equivalent of a full day's wages back east. A single shovel, a pickaxe, a loaf of bread, all fetched astronomical prices. In this bizarre new world, wealth was relative. A man with a poke full of gold dust, but an empty stomach, was a poor man indeed. This is the central irony of the gold rush. Historians still argue about the long-term economic impact on the average prospector. While some struck it rich, many scholars contend that the vast majority of individual miners spent more on their overpriced supplies than they ever found in gold. The real consistent fortunes were made by the merchants and shippers, the men who mined the miners by selling them the tools, and, most importantly, the food they needed to survive. Your life as a prospector is one of obsessive, back-breaking labor. You stand waist-deep in an icy mountain stream for 12 hours a day, washing pan after pan of gravel, your eyes straining for the slightest yellow glint. You have no time or energy for hunting or farming. You need food that is ready, requires minimal preparation, and will not spoil. And so your diet becomes a monotonous trinity of gold rush staples: hard, stale biscuits, beans boiled to a mush, and the ever-present, ever-reliable salt pork. In the remote mining camps, a barrel of salt pork was a treasure in its own right. When a mule train finally made its way up the treacherous mountain trails, laden with provisions from the boomtown of San Francisco, you would see grizzled, hopeful men eagerly line up. They would pay for a greasy slab of pork, not with coins, but with a carefully weighed pinch of gold dust, tipping the precious yellow powder from their deerskin pouches onto the merchant's scales. That piece of meat, purchased with the fruits of a week's labor, was your steak. It was the fuel that would allow you to keep working, to keep hoping, to keep sifting the riverbed for another day. A barrel of pork in your tent was a far more tangible asset than the uncertain promise of gold in the hills. But what happened when a prospector finally hit the jackpot, finding a rich vein or a heavy nugget? He would make his way to the nearest town, like Hangtown, so named for its early method of frontier justice, to celebrate his new wealth. And here, a legendary dish was born. The story goes that a lucky miner swaggered into a hotel and demanded the most expensive meal the kitchen could make. The cook looked at his supplies. The most expensive things he had, the rarest delicacies in this food-starved land, were fresh oysters, shipped on ice at great expense from the coast, eggs, a luxury item carted carefully over the mountains, and bacon, the high-demand staple of every miner's diet. The cook, in a moment of inspiration, combined them. He created an omelet of eggs, oysters, and fried salt pork. This was the birth of the Hangtown Fry, a quirky and enduring culinary legacy of the gold rush. It became the ultimate status symbol, a dish you ate to announce to the world that you had finally struck it rich. It was the perfect meal for the moment, the humble, salty fuel of your poverty now united on a plate with the rarest of luxuries. In the chaos of the goldfields, you saw the apotheosis of salt pork. It was a currency, a treasure, the absolute bedrock of a society stripped down to its essentials. The 19th century, with its whaling voyages, its wagon trains, and its gold rushes, was in many ways the final glorious era of this ancient food. But the very same century, with its restless energy and its feverish belief in progress and invention, was also quietly developing the technologies that would bring the long reign of salt pork to an end. While you were panning for gold with a slab of bacon in your tent, a quiet revolution was happening back east in the laboratories, factories, and kitchens of a rapidly industrializing world. The first great challenger to the supremacy of salt arrived in a sealed container. The story begins, as so many of our stories do, with the need to feed an army. In the late 1790s, Napoleon Bonaparte offered a hefty prize to anyone who could invent a reliable new method for preserving food for his far-flung armies. A French confectioner and chef named Nicolas Appert claimed the prize. After years of experimentation, he discovered that if you placed food in a thick glass bottle, sealed it tightly with a cork, and then boiled it in water for a long time, the food would remain preserved indefinitely. He didn't understand the science of bacteria, but he had perfected the technique of killing them with heat and preventing them from getting back in. This was the birth of canning. The idea was revolutionary, but glass bottles were heavy and fragile. The real breakthrough for mass production came when the process was adapted to tin-plated iron canisters. The tin can was born. For decades, it remained a curiosity. Early cans were made of thick metal and were incredibly difficult to get into. A quirky but true detail is that the instructions printed on cans from the 1820s often read, "Cut round the top near the outer edge with a chisel and hammer." Opening your dinner was a significant home improvement project. Because of the cost and difficulty, canned goods were mostly used on Arctic expeditions and other high-stakes ventures. But the technology was steadily improving, and the American Civil War gave the industry a massive boost, scaling up production to supply the Union Army with everything from tinned meats to the first condensed milk. For the first time in history, there was a shelf-stable food that wasn't reliant on being saturated with salt, sugar, or smoke. But an even more formidable rival was on the horizon, a technology that attacked the very premise of preservation itself. If you couldn't keep food from spoiling at room temperature, what if you could change the temperature? The revolution began not with machines, but with frozen water. In the early 19th century, a Bostonian entrepreneur named Frederick Tudor, the Ice King, started harvesting ice from New England ponds in the winter, insulating it in sawdust, and shipping it to warm climates like the Caribbean and India. This created a global demand for ice and led to the invention of the domestic icebox, a simple insulated cabinet that could keep food fresh for days. The age of cold was beginning. The true game changer, however, was the invention of artificial refrigeration. Through the mid-19th century, inventors perfected the science of vapor compression cycles, creating machines that could generate cold on demand, anywhere, anytime. And the single most important application of this new technology was the refrigerated railroad car. This is a mainstream historical fact that truly changed the world. In the 1870s, a Chicago meatpacker named Gustavus Swift perfected a design for a refrigerated car that could reliably ship fresh, butchered meat across the country. Before this, if you wanted beef in New York, you had to ship live cattle all the way from the West, a costly, cruel, and inefficient process. Swift slaughtered his cattle in the great stockyards of Chicago, chilled the carcasses, and shipped them east. The impact was immediate and profound. Suddenly, a family in Boston could walk into a butcher shop in the middle of February and buy a fresh, high-quality steak from a cow raised 1,000 miles away, for a price they could actually afford. The ancient rhythm of the seasons, the autumn slaughter and the winter reliance on the salt barrel was being broken. Why would you eat tough, ferociously salty pork when you could have a fresh, tender pork chop? The refrigerated railroad car, and later the refrigerated steamship, did not just change the food industry. They annihilated the geographical and seasonal barriers that had defined what people ate for all of human history. Economic historians still argue about which technology had a more profound impact on the 19th century diet. Canning, which made seasonal vegetables available year-round, or refrigeration, which completely transformed the market for fresh meat and dairy. But for our story, the verdict is clear. Together, these two quiet, relentless innovations were signaling the end of an era. The tin can and the icebox were the assassins of the salt pork barrel. Its millennia-long reign was finally coming to a close, not because it had failed, but because human ingenuity had, at last, created a better way. The refrigerated railway car rumbles across the continent, carrying fresh meat from Chicago to Boston, a sound that tolls the bell for the age of salt pork. The tin can gleams on the grocer's shelf, a silent promise of out-of-season vegetables and preserved meats that don't need a barrel of brine. For most of the world in the burgeoning comfort of the early 20th century, our story seems to be over. But on the very fringes of human endeavor, in the last blank spaces on the map, the new technologies were not yet fully trusted. In the coldest, most hostile environment on the planet, the ancient, time-tested principles of meat preservation were about to embark on one last, heroic journey. The great terrestrial prize is the South Pole. It is the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, and you are part of an expedition, a small band of men venturing into a continent of pure elemental hostility. The cold here is not just an inconvenience. It is an active, malevolent force that drains the life from you. The wind, the katabatic gales that pour off the high ice plateau can flay skin from bone. The landscape is a blinding, featureless desert of white, a place that seems actively hostile to life itself. Your journey to the pole and back will be a months-long ordeal of dragging heavy sledges over the ice. A journey where a single mistake in planning means a slow, frozen death. In this environment, your body becomes a furnace that must be constantly stoked. You are burning thousands of calories a day just to stay warm, on top of the immense exertion of hauling the sledges. Food is not just sustenance, it is your only source of heat, your only defense against the cold. The planning of the rations is an obsessive life-or-death science. And while your main base on the coast might be stocked with canned goods, for the final desperate push to the interior, you put your faith in a more ancient and reliable technology. Cans are heavy, and the liquid inside can freeze and burst the seams. You need the most calorie-dense, stable, and lightweight food possible. You need pemmican. Pemmican is the logical endpoint of the journey we've been on. It is a super-concentrated brick of energy, first perfected by the indigenous peoples of North America. It is made from lean meat, dried until it is brittle, and then pulverized into a powder. This powder is then mixed with an equal amount of hot rendered fat. The resulting paste is packed into bags and cools into a solid, stable block that will last for years. It is the very essence of our story. Remove the water, add the fat. Alongside the pemmican, your ration includes biscuits, tea, sugar, and a generous amount of our old friend in its most beloved form, bacon. The high-fat content of the cured pork belly was prized by polar explorers as an essential fuel. Your daily meal is a hot, greasy stew called a hoosh, a mixture of melted snow, pemmican, and biscuit, often with chunks of bacon thrown in for extra fat and flavor. The ultimate test of these provisions came in the famous race to the pole between the Norwegian Roald Amundsen and the British naval officer Robert Falcon Scott. It was a dramatic duel of two vastly different approaches to polar travel. Amundsen, the victor, was a master of efficiency. He learned from the Inuit, using teams of sled dogs to pull his sledges. His rations were incredibly high in fat, and he made a grimly practical calculation. The dogs were not just his engines, they were also a mobile larder. As his sledges got lighter, he systematically slaughtered the weaker dogs to feed the others, and to provide fresh, hot meat for his men. Scott's expedition, by contrast, was a tragic story of heroic failure. He put his faith in a combination of ill-suited ponies, motorized sledges that quickly broke down in the extreme cold, and finally, the brutal, exhausting labor of man-hauling. Historians and polar experts still fiercely debate the precise reasons for the failure of the Scott expedition. Was it bad luck, poor leadership, or a fundamentally flawed ration and transport strategy? Whatever the cause, the outcome was heartbreaking. Scott's party reached the pole on January 17, 1912, only to find the Norwegian flag fluttering in the wind. Amundsen had beaten them by 34 days. Demoralized and exhausted, they began the 800-mile journey back. The brutal Antarctic winter closed in. Weakened by a diet that was likely deficient in calories and vitamins and suffering from frostbite, they fought their way back across the ice shelf, only to die in their tent, just 11 miles short of a massive supply depot that could have saved them. To fight the psychological strain of their journey, they had even produced a handwritten newspaper, the South Polar Times, to entertain themselves during the dark winter months. But no amount of good cheer could overcome the brutal mathematics of starvation and cold. In the final, starkest test of human endurance, in the whitest, quietest, and longest journey of them all, the ancient wisdom of the salt cure had its last great moment. The victory belonged to the man whose fatty provisions, whose brutal, efficient use of preserved and mobile meat, were simply better. At the bottom of the world, in the frozen quiet of Antarctica, the story of traditional salt-cured meat reached its heroic, tragic conclusion. But just 2 years after Scott and his men perished on the ice, the world erupted in a cataclysm that would make all previous human endeavors seem small. The long, quiet journeys of exploration were replaced by the deafening, static horror of the First World War. The challenge was no longer about provisioning a handful of brave men, but about feeding millions, trapped in the mud of a continent-spanning trench system. The age of the barrel was truly over, but the legacy of salt pork was about to be reborn in tin. You are a British soldier, a Tommy, hunkered down in a muddy trench on the Western Front. Your world is a narrow, squalid ditch, a landscape of craters, barbed wire, and the constant dull thud of artillery. This is industrial warfare, and it is sustained by industrial logistics. Every single day, a river of supplies flows from the factories of Britain to the front lines. Millions of bullets, millions of shells, and millions of rations. The sheer scale is staggering. By the later years of the war, the British Army was delivering over 3 million individual rations to its soldiers every single day. This was a feat made possible by the two technologies that had ended the dominance of the salt barrel: the railroad and the tin can. Your daily ration arrives in a sandbag, passed down the line, and its contents would be grimly familiar to a sailor from Nelson-A's Navy or a soldier from the Civil War. There are the hardtack biscuits, perfectly uniform and factory-made, but just as hard as their predecessors. And there is the meat. It is not called salt horse anymore. Now it is bully beef. This is corned beef, packed tightly into a distinctive, tapered tin. The principle is exactly the same as the salt pork of old. It is meat, preserved in a salt brine, with the can acting as a modern, miniature, and perfectly sealed barrel. You pry it open to reveal a mass of shredded meat and gelatinous fat. It is salty, greasy, and after you have eaten it for the 500th time, profoundly boring. This was the fuel of the trenches. You might eat it cold, spread on a biscuit, or if you were lucky enough to have a small fire going, you could fry it. Soldiers became experts at repurposing their meager rations. A favorite trick was to crumble up the biscuits, shred the bully beef, find a wild onion growing on the parados of the trench, and fry it all up in the fat from the tin to create a bully hash. The tins themselves, once empty, were used as mugs, candle holders, or even filled with scraps and a fuse to make improvised grenades. But the monotony was a weapon of the enemy. Military historians still argue about the nutritional adequacy of these rations and their impact on morale. While they prevented starvation, the vitamin deficiencies and sheer soul-crushing sameness were undoubtedly a factor in the war weariness that afflicted the armies. Jump forward 2 decades. The world is at war again, but World War II is a war of motion, of blitzkrieg and island hopping. The rations must now be fully portable, designed for the individual soldier on the move. And so, the American military perfected the individual combat ration, the famous C ration. It consisted of several small cans, a B unit with biscuits and dessert, and an M unit for meat. And the undisputed king of the M unit, the food that would become synonymous with the Allied victory, was the direct technological descendant of salt pork: Spam. You are a GI on a Pacific island. You use your P-38 can opener to open a tin of Spam. The familiar rectangular pink block slides out with a soft hiss. What is it exactly? It is a marvel of food science, the culmination of millennia of preservation. It's chopped pork shoulder and ham, mixed with salt, water, sugar, and sodium nitrite. A modern scientific version of the saltpeter that was sometimes used in older cures. It is in essence a perfect salt pork. It has no bones. It is pre-cooked. It is shelf-stable for years. It is incredibly high in fat and calories. It can be eaten cold right out of the can, or fried until it's crispy and sizzling. It fueled the armies that fought their way across Europe and the Pacific. It was everywhere, served in endless and sometimes horrifying variations by army cooks. And like bully beef before it, the soldiers complained about it endlessly. But they ate it. It was the taste of the war. The physical form had changed dramatically, from a rough-hewn slab in a leaky wooden barrel to a perfectly uniform pink block in a vacuum-sealed can, but its core identity remained the same. It was a simple, salty, fatty piece of the pig, preserved against time, still providing the fuel for the longest and most difficult journeys a person could be asked to make. While the ghost of salt pork was serving on the battlefields of the 20th century, neatly packed in tins of bully beef and Spam, the original article, the simple fatty slab, cured in salt, was undergoing a quiet transformation back on the home front. The technologies of canning and refrigeration had pushed it from the center of the plate in most American homes, but in the pockets of the country where the old ways held on, either through tradition or through poverty, salt pork didn't disappear. Instead, it underwent a graceful evolution, retiring from its role as a main course and taking on a new, more subtle, and arguably more flavorful identity. You are in a small, clean-swept kitchen in the rural American South, or an Appalachian hollow during the Great Depression of the 1930s. The world outside is gripped by economic hardship. Money is scarce, and every scrap of food is precious. This is a time of making do, of stretching what little you have. Refrigeration is a distant luxury. Your food is kept cool in a cellar or a spring house. The Great Depression saw a massive resurgence in traditional skills, home gardening, canning, and, of course, preserving meat the old-fashioned way. For you, the annual hog slaughter is still a cornerstone of your year, a vital ritual that stocks your pantry against the lean times. But you are not eating great hunks of salt pork every day like a 19th century sailor. Your diet, while simple, has more variety. You have your garden vegetables, your cornmeal, your dried beans. In this context, the salt pork becomes not the bulk of the meal, but its soul. It is a flavoring agent of almost magical power. A single small piece of cured pork, humble and inexpensive, can elevate a pot of simple ingredients into something deeply savory and satisfying. It is no longer a survival ration. It is a culinary secret weapon. Its most iconic role is with a mess of greens. You take a thick piece of salt pork, or one of its close relatives like streaky fatback or a bit of hog jowl, and you drop it into a heavy cast iron pot. You let it cook slowly, rendering its fat, the kitchen filling with that unmistakable, comforting, greasy aroma. Then you add your greens, collards, turnips, or mustard greens fresh from your garden, and a little water. You let them simmer for hours, stewing down until they are meltingly tender, their slight bitterness perfectly balanced by the salty, smoky flavor of the pork. The process creates a rich, nourishing broth at the bottom of the pot, a savory liquor infused with the essence of the pork and the vitamins from the greens. This broth is called pot liquor. This pot liquor was so important to Southern cuisine that it became a cultural touchstone. It was never thrown away. It was drunk like a tonic, or most famously, sopped up with a piece of crumbly, crusty cornbread. There was even a quirky, widely publicized debate in the 1930s between Louisiana's populist Governor Huey Long and a Georgia newspaper editor about the proper etiquette of eating it. Should one dunk the cornbread into the pot liquor or crumble it in like croutons? That such a humble byproduct of cooking greens could inspire a public argument between politicians tells you everything you need to know about its place in the heart of the people. This transformation from main course to seasoning is the final, domestic chapter of our food's long journey. A chunk of salt pork in a pot of pinto beans simmering all day gives them a depth and richness that cannot be replicated. The rendered fat is still the preferred cooking medium for many of the region's most famous dishes, from fried chicken to fried green tomatoes. Folklorists and food historians still argue about the precise origins of Southern cuisine. How much is a blend of West African, British, and Native American traditions, and how much was it simply shaped by the harsh economics of poverty? The centrality of cured pork products, used to flavor the cheap and abundant staples of corn and beans, suggests that necessity was, as always, the mother of culinary invention. So, as the modern world rushed forward, salt pork stepped back. It found a permanent and cherished home, not on long sea voyages or in military campaigns, but in the regional kitchens of America. It laid down its heavy burden as the food of last resort and became something gentler, the flavor of tradition, the taste of home. It was no longer the fuel that got you through the journey, but the comforting meal that was waiting for you at the end. In the warm, fragrant kitchens of the American South, salt pork found a gentle and respectable retirement, transforming from a survival ration into the soul of a beloved regional cuisine. For decades, this was its quiet, final role, a food of nostalgia and tradition, largely ignored by the wider culinary world, which was rushing toward convenience and processed foods. But as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, a new sensibility began to take hold. A generation raised on fast food and shrink-wrapped meat began to look backwards, searching for something more authentic, more flavorful, and more connected to the past. And in this search, the ancient art of curing pork was about to be rediscovered and reborn. You are in a high-end restaurant in a bustling American city. The lighting is low, the conversation is a gentle hum. You are part of the modern world of foodie culture. A new movement, a reaction against the industrial food system, has swept through the culinary landscape. We call it farm-to-table or locavore, a philosophy that emphasizes local, seasonal, and traditional ways of eating. A key part of this movement has been a renaissance of old-world skills, a revival of the arts of the butcher, the baker, and the charcutier. And on the menu tonight, you see the glorious results of this revival. The first sign of this renaissance came from across the ocean. American chefs and food lovers looked to Europe, particularly Italy, where the art of curing pork, the salumi tradition, had never been lost. It had been refined over centuries into a form of high art. You see its superstars on charcuterie boards. There is pancetta, which is essentially the Italian cousin of salt pork. It is pork belly, cured with salt, but also with a more delicate and aromatic blend of spices like pepper, fennel, and nutmeg. It's not smoked like American bacon, but air-dried, giving it a silky texture and a deep, complex flavor. Then there is the king of cured pork fat, guanciale. This is cured pork jowl or cheek, a cut prized for its high ratio of exquisite fat to meat. You learn that this is the secret, the non-negotiable ingredient, for classic Roman pasta dishes like carbonara and amatriciana. To use bacon instead, a chef might tell you with a dramatic sigh, is a culinary crime. And for the ultimate expression of this art, you might encounter lardo. This is nothing more than pure pork fatback, the same cut that a lumberjack would have boiled with his beans. But here, in a tradition perfected in places like Colonial, Tuscany, it is treated with the reverence of a fine wine. The fat is aged for months in tubs carved from the local Carrara marble, layered with sea salt and fresh rosemary. The porous marble is said to breathe, imparting a unique sweetness to the fat. Sliced paper thin and served melting onto a piece of warm, crusty bread, it is a transcendent experience. Inspired by these profound and ancient traditions, a new generation of American chefs and artisans began to look at their own backyard. They realized that the humble salt pork and country hams of their grandparents a generation were part of the same great tradition. They began seeking out farmers who were raising heritage breeds of pigs, Tamworths, Berkshires, Gloucester Old Spots, animals that, unlike their lean, modern counterparts, were prized for their rich, flavorful fat. These artisans started building their own curing rooms, experimenting with different kinds of salt, sugars, and smoking woods. And so the humble has become haute. Salt pork, once a symbol of poverty, starts appearing on the menus of the most exclusive restaurants. A chef might proudly describe the provenance of the fatback used to flavor a dish of beans. A high-end butcher shop will sell you a piece of salt pork made from a pasture-raised heritage pig, for a price that would have made a 19th century sailor faint. This entire movement has, of course, been the subject of debate. Food critics and sociologists still argue about its cultural significance. Is it a genuine and sustainable return to valuing traditional food? Or is it a temporary, elitist trend, a way for the wealthy to purchase a feeling of authenticity? Whatever the answer, the result is undeniable. After a long journey through history as the anonymous, functional, and often despised food of necessity, salt pork has come full circle. It has been reclaimed, celebrated, and elevated. Its long, quiet journey has taken it from the bottom of a sailor's barrel, through the trenches of war, and the hardships of the frontier, to a place of honor on the modern table. The simple salty art of curing a piece of pork fat against the ravages of time is no longer just a means of survival. It is once again, and at last, a craft to be celebrated. Our story has brought our humble food full circle, from a survival ration of staggering importance to a celebrated artisanal delicacy. You've seen how this simple combination of salt and pork has physically built the world we live in, fueling the journeys of soldiers, sailors, pioneers, and builders. But a food that was so central to the daily struggle and success of our ancestors for thousands of years does not simply fade away when its practical purpose is gone. It leaves behind echoes, fossils, and faint aromas in the most surprising of places. It leaves its mark on our culture and most profoundly on the very language you speak every day. You have almost certainly used these phrases yourself, without a second thought for their origin. Our language is a living museum, and the study of these expressions, or idioms, is a mainstream focus for linguists. It reveals how the customs and technologies of the past remain embedded in our modern speech. And when it comes to the world of pigs and preserved pork, that museum is particularly rich. Let's start with the most famous exhibit. You hear a friend talk about their job, about working hard to provide for their family. They say they're bringing home the bacon. The phrase is a perfect synonym for earning a living. But why bacon? The origins are debated by etymologists, the scholars who dig into the history of words. One of the most charming theories and a quirky historical fact is the tradition of the Dunmow flitch. In the town of Great Dunmow, England, a custom dating back to at least the 12th century awarded a flitch, or a side of bacon, to any married couple who could come forward and swear an oath that for a year and a day, they had lived in perfect harmony, without a single argument or regret. If they could convince a jury of their peers the bacon was theirs, and they were paraded through the town in celebration. This tradition, amazingly, still exists. So in this sense, bringing home the bacon was a literal reward for domestic bliss and success. Another more modern theory ties the phrase to the world of boxing in the early 20th century. But whatever its true origin, the core idea is the same. Bacon, the most prized form of cured pork, is the symbol of success, the reward for a job well done. Now consider a much darker phrase you might hear on the news. A politician is accused of pork barrel spending. This means they are using government funds for local projects that benefit their constituents, often in a wasteful way, simply to win votes. The origin of this term is grimly illustrative. It comes from the pre-Civil War practice on plantations of doling out rations of salt pork from a barrel. The enslaved people would have to crowd around this barrel to get their meager share. The image was later adapted to describe politicians handing out favors to their supporters, who likewise gathered eagerly for their portion. Let's move to a phrase about wealth: living high on the hog. This comes directly from the practicalities of butchering a pig. The best cuts of meat, the loin, the upper leg for hams, are located on the upper part of the animal. The lower parts, the belly, the hocks, the jowls, the feet, were considered inferior and were the traditional food of the poor. So, if you were living high on the hog, it meant you were wealthy enough to afford the prime cuts, leaving the belly bacon and salty fatback for everyone else. Even our casual conversations are seasoned with this history. Have you ever sat with a friend for a long, leisurely chat, just chewing the fat? The phrase likely originates with sailors or soldiers, idly and slowly chewing on a tough, gristly piece of salt pork or bacon rind, a process that could take a great deal of time, perfect for a long, rambling conversation. And if you decide to do something with complete and utter commitment, you go whole hog. This is a phrase born of the peasant's world. You don't just buy a single cut of meat, you commit to the whole animal, using everything from nose to tail, a decision that is total and all-encompassing. These are just a few of the ghosts of the salt barrel that haunt our language. They are so deeply embedded that we no longer see them. But they are there. When we speak of earning a living, of political corruption, of social status, or even just having a chat, we are unknowingly channeling the world of the medieval peasant, the antebellum South, and the long, quiet journeys of sailors at sea. The simple, salty history of pork is not just the story of a food. It is a story that we are, in some small way, still telling every single day. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, a journey that has followed a simple food through the grand sweep of human history. We have seen how its ghosts live on in the phrases we speak every day, a quiet linguistic residue of a time when salt and pork were cornerstones of civilization. But what of the thing itself? What is the final resting place for the food that fueled empires, discovered continents, and settled a nation? Where is the salt pork now? Our path tonight has been a long one. You have stood in the cool salt cellars of a medieval farm, and on the sweltering, chaotic docks of the Age of Sail. You felt the creak of a Viking longship under your feet, and the frozen ground of Valley Forge through your worn-out shoes. You've tasted the monotonous ration on a lonely whaling ship, and the savory sizzle of bacon in a pioneer's campfire. You have seen this one food serve as a tool of oppression, a pirate's treasure, a soldier's burden, and a prospector's stake. For millennia, it was everywhere. It was a fundamental, unavoidable, and essential fact of life. And now it is almost completely gone. Walk through a modern supermarket. The aisles are a brightly lit paradise of abundance that would make a 16th century sea captain weep. You see an entire section dedicated to fresh pork in dozens of different cuts. You see a refrigerated case full of its most popular descendant, bacon, in endless varieties. You see its more modern offspring, Spam and other canned meats, sitting patiently on the shelf. But the original article, the simple, unsmoked, heavily cured slab of salt pork that is the hero of our story, is likely nowhere to be found. It has become, in the mainstream world, a culinary fossil. Its disappearance was not a sudden event, but a slow, quiet fading, the result of the very progress it helped to build. The refrigerated railway car and the tin can, as we saw, were the primary assassins. They offered variety, freshness, and convenience on a scale that the old salt barrel could never match. Modern transportation networks mean that even in the dead of winter, we can have fresh vegetables from a warmer climate. Our palates, accustomed to a world of subtle and diverse flavors, have lost the tolerance for the ferocious saltiness and heavy fattiness that our ancestors craved and needed. The central problem that salt pork solved, the defeat of time and distance, was simply solved better by other means. It does, however, live on in quiet pockets of the world. In the traditional kitchens of the American South, it remains an essential flavoring. In Newfoundland, Canada, a place shaped by the sea, a traditional dinner is not complete without scrunchions, small, crispy fried cubes of salt pork sprinkled on top. It is treasured by off-grid homesteaders and survivalists who still value its incredible shelf life and the fact that it can be made without electricity or complex equipment. It has retreated from the world stage, returning to its most ancient role, a food of self-sufficiency for those on the quiet fringes. And as we look to the future, its story offers a new perspective. Food futurists still argue about the future of meat itself. Will lab-grown and plant-based alternatives one day make all animal agriculture obsolete, turning even a fresh pork chop into the kind of historical curiosity that salt pork is today? The story of salt pork, then, is the story of a long, quiet journey coming to an end. It was the perfect food for journeys because it was itself on a journey, its biological clock stopped by a blanket of salt, waiting patiently in the dark of a barrel or the hold of a ship. Its slow fade from our lives is not a tragedy. It is a quiet symbol of our success. Its absence from our tables is a testament to a world largely freed from the relentless, gnawing anxiety of hunger and spoilage that haunted our ancestors. We no longer need it, and that is a profoundly peaceful thought. We can look back on its long and vital history, not with a craving for its taste, but with a deep and quiet gratitude for the journeys it made possible. And so, our own journey for tonight comes to its gentle close. The figures we have met along the way, the Roman legionary, the Viking sailor, the weary pioneer, can all recede now, fading back into the soft mists of history. The sounds of the creaking ship, the sizzling campfire, and the distant roar of the axe can all dissolve into the quiet of your own room. There are no more long and difficult roads to travel tonight, no more hardships to endure. You are safe and comfortable, and your own journey is now a much simpler and softer one, a slow and easy drift into deep and restful sleep. Let the story go, and feel the stillness settle around you, as the last thoughts of the day begin to dissolve, leaving only peace and the gentle, steady rhythm of your own quiet breathing.